The Truman Doctrine was an American foreign policy to stop Soviet imperialism during the Cold War. It was announced to Congress by President Harry S. Truman on March 12, 1947, when he pledged to contain Soviet threats to Greece and Turkey. No American military force was involved. Instead, Congress appropriated a free gift of financial aid to support the economies and the militaries of Greece and Turkey. More generally, the Truman Doctrine implied American support for other nations threatened by Soviet communism. The Truman Doctrine became the foundation of American foreign policy, and led, in 1949, to the formation of NATO, a full-fledged military alliance that is in effect to this day. Historians often use Truman's speech to date the start of the Cold War. Truman told Congress that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Truman reasoned, because these totalitarian regimes coerce free peoples. They represented a threat to international peace and the national security of the United States. Truman made the plea amid the crisis of the Greek Civil War. He argued that if Greece and Turkey did not receive the aid that they urgently needed, they would inevitably fall to communism with grave consequences throughout the region. Because Turkey and Greece were historic rivals, it was necessary to help both equally, even though the threat to Greece was more immediate. Eric Fohn argues, the Truman Doctrine set a precedent for American assistance to anti-communist regimes throughout the world, no matter how undemocratic, and for the creation of a set of global military alliances directed against the Soviet Union. For years Britain had supported Greece, but was now near bankruptcy and was forced to radically reduce its involvement. In February 1947, Britain formally requested the United States take over its role in supporting the Greek government. The policy won the support of Republicans who controlled Congress and involved sending $400 million in American money, but no military forces, to the region. The effect was to end the communist threat, and in 1952, both Greece and Turkey joined NATO, a military alliance that guaranteed their protection. The doctrine was informally extended to become the basis of American Cold War policy throughout Europe and around the world. It shifted American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union from Dayton to a policy of containment of Soviet expansion as advocated by diplomat George Kennan. It avoided the policy of rollback because it implicitly tolerated the previous Soviet takeovers in Eastern Europe. Turkish Straits crisis. At the conclusion of World War II, Turkey was pressured by the Soviet government to allow Russian shipping to flow freely through the Turkish Straits, which connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. As the Turkish government would not submit to the Soviet Union's requests, tensions arose in the region, leading to a show of naval force on the side of the Soviets. Since British assistance to Turkey had ended in 1947, the U.S. dispatched military aid to ensure that Turkey would retain chief control of the passage. Turkey received $100 million in economic and military aid, and the U.S. sent the aircraft carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt. The post-war period from 1946 started with a multi-party period, and the Democratic Party government of Adnan Menderes. Greek crisis. In 1946–47, the United States and the Soviet Union moved from being wartime allies to Cold War adversaries. During that time, Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe, its delayed withdrawal from Iran, and the breakdown of Allied cooperation in Germany provide the backdrop of escalating tensions for the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. response has been much debated by historians. To Harry S. Truman, with growing unrest in Greece, it began to look like a pincer movement against the oil-rich areas of the Middle East and the warm water ports of the Mediterranean. In February 1946, Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, sent his famed long telegram, which predicted the Soviets would only respond to force and that the best way to handle them would be through a long-term strategy of containment. that is, stopping their geographical expansion. After the British warned that they could no longer help Greece, and following Prime Minister Saldaras's visit to Washington in December 1946 to ask for American assistance, the U.S. State Department formulated a plan. Aid would be given to both Greece and Turkey, to help cool the long-standing rivalry between them. In March 1947, President Truman appeared before Congress and used Kennan's containment policy as the basis for what became known as the Truman Doctrine. To pass any legislation, Truman needed the support of the Republicans, who controlled both houses of Congress. The chief Republican spokesman, Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg, strongly supported Truman and overcame the doubts of isolationists such as Senator Robert A. Taft. American policymakers recognized the instability of the region, fearing that if Greece was lost to communism, Turkey would not last long. Similarly, if Turkey yielded to Soviet demands, the position of Greece would be endangered. That is, it was a regional domino effect threat that guided the American decision. Greece and Turkey were strategic allies, important for geographical reasons as well, for the fall of Greece would put the Soviets on a particularly dangerous flank for the Turks, and strengthened the Soviet Union's ability to cut off Allied supply lines in the event of war. The Truman Doctrine was the first in a series of containment moves by the United States, followed by economic restoration of Western Europe through the Marshall Plan and military containment by the creation of NATO in 1949. President Truman made the proclamation in an address to the U.S. Congress on March 12, 1947, amid the crisis of the Greek Civil War. Truman insisted that if Greece and Turkey did not receive the aid that they needed, they would inevitably fall to communism with consequences throughout the region. Greece. In the second stage of the Civil War in December 1944, the British helped prevent the seizure of Athens by the National Liberation Front, controlled effectively by the Greek Communist Party. In the third phase, guerrilla forces controlled by the Greek Communist Party fought against the internationally recognized Greek government, which was formed after 1946. Elections boycotted by the KKE. The British realized that the Greek leftists were being directly funded by Josip Broz Tito in neighboring Yugoslavia. The Greek communists received little help directly from the Soviet Union, while Yugoslavia provided support and sanctuary. By late 1946, the weakening British economy informed the United States that it could no longer continue to provide military and economic support to Greece. In May 1947, 2 months after Truman's plea, Congress approved $400 million in military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey. Increased American aid helped defeat the KKE, after interim defeats for government forces from 1946 to 1948. Long-term policy and metaphor. The Truman Doctrine underpinned American Cold War policy in Europe and around the world. The doctrine endured because it addressed a broader cultural insecurity regarding modern life in a globalized world. It dealt with Washington's concern over communism's domino effect. It enabled a media-sensitive presentation of the doctrine that won bipartisan support, and it mobilized American economic power to modernize and stabilize unstable regions without direct military intervention. It brought nation-building activities and modernization programs to the forefront of foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine became a metaphor for emergency aid to keep a nation from communist influence. Truman used disease imagery not only to communicate a sense of impending disaster in the spread of communism but also to create a rhetorical vision of containing it by extending a protective shield around non-communist countries throughout the world. It echoed the quarantine the aggressor policy Roosevelt sought to impose to contain German and Japanese expansion in 1937. The medical metaphor extended beyond the immediate aims of the Truman Doctrine in that the imagery combined with fire and flood imagery evocative of disaster provided the United States with an easy transition to direct military confrontation in later years with communist forces in Korea and Vietnam. By presenting ideological differences in life-or-death terms, Truman was able to garner support for this communism-containing policy. Bibliography. Beisner, Robert L. Dean Atchison. A Life in the Cold War. Bosdorf, Denise M. Proclaiming the Truman Doctrine. The Cold War Call to Arms excerpt and text search. Bullock, Alan. Ernest Bevan. Foreign Secretary, 1945–1951 on British Roles. Edwards, Lee. Congress and the Origins of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine, World Affairs, Volume 151, 1989 online edition. Frazier, Robert. Atchison and the Formulation of the Truman Doctrine, Journal of Modern Greek Studies 1999 17. 229–251. ISSN 0738-1727. Frazier, Robert. Kennan, Universalism, and the Truman Doctrine, Journal of Cold War Studies, Spring 2009, Volume 11 Issue 2, pp 3–34. Gaddis, John Lewis. Reconsiderations. Was the Truman Doctrine a real turning point? Foreign Affairs 1974-52. 386–402. ISSN 0015-7120. Hines, Lynn Boyd, and Theodore Otto Wind, Jr. The Cold War as Rhetoric. The Beginnings, 1945–1950 online edition. Iotrides, John O. and Nicholas X. Rizopoulos. The International Dimension of the Greek Civil War, World Policy Journal 2017. 87–103. ISSN 0740-2775 full text. In EBSCO. IV. Robert L. Fire, Flood, and Red Fever. Motivating Metaphors of Global Emergency in the Truman Doctrine Speech. Presidential Studies Quarterly 29. 570–591. DOI 10.1111, J 0268-2141, 2003.00050X. Jeffrey, Judith S. Ambiguous Commitments and Uncertain Policies. The Truman Doctrine in Greece, 1947–1952. 257 pp. Jones, Howard. A New Kind of War. America's Global Strategy and the Truman Doctrine in Greece. 327 pp. Kyroglu, Baron. Strategic Imperatives, Democratic Rhetoric. The United States and Turkey, 1945–52, Cold War History, August 2009, Volume 9, pp. 321–345. Kolko, Joyce, Kolko, Gabriel. The Limits of Power. The World and United States Foreign Policy, 1945–1954. New York, New York. Harper & Row. ISBN 978-0060-12447-2. Leffler, Melvin P. Strategy, Diplomacy, and the Cold War. The United States, Turkey, and NATO, 1945–1952, Journal of American History 1985–71, 807–825, ISSN 0021-8723 and JSTOR. Lykogiannis, Athanasios. Britain and the Greek Economic Crisis, 1944–1947. From Liberation to the Truman Doctrine. U. of Missouri Press, 2002. 287 pp. Online edition. McGee, George. The U.S.-Turkish NATO-Middle East Connection. How the Truman Doctrine and Turkey's NATO entry contained the Soviets in the Middle East. 224 pp. Merrill, Dennis. The Truman Doctrine. Containing Communism in Modernity. Presidential Studies Quarterly 36, 27-37. DOI 10.1111, J. 1741-5705, 2006.00284, X. Myertons, Heiko. The Doctrines of U.S. Security Policy, an Evaluation under International Law, ISBN 978-0-521-76648-7. Offner, Arnold A. Another Such Victory. President Truman, American Foreign Policy, and the Cold War, Diplomatic History 1999-23. 127-155, ISSN 01452096. Pack Jr., Chester J. Arming the Free World. The Origins of the United States Military Assistance Program, 1945-1950, online edition. Painter, David S. Oil and the American Century. The Journal of American History 99. 24-39. DOI 10.1093, Jahist, JAS 073. Pieper, Moritz A. Containment and the Cold War. Re-examining the doctrine of containment as a grand strategy driving U.S. Cold War interventions. StudentPulse.com. Retrieved the 22nd of August 2012. Spaulding, Elizabeth Edwards. The First Cold Warrior. Harry Truman, Containment, and the Remaking of Liberal Internationalism.